Present. Okay, so welcome to Documenting Your Work COVID edition. I'm Augustus Wendell. I'm an assistant professor of the practice in art history and visual studies. I'm also a faculty advisor for the VMS CS IDM, which is the Visual Media Studies and Computer Science interdisciplinary major that was approved this year and will be going into action next year. And I am also core faculty with Computational Media, Art and Culture group, which runs PhD and MA programs. And this is my email address, so feel free to reach out and contact me if you have any follow-up questions or anything of the likes that aligns with what you're seeing in this presentation. I also should mention that as I'm presenting, I'm going to have all of you hidden from me for the most part until we just do a little round robin in a few slides. So I would hope to make this presentation rather informal and that you should feel free to unmute and chat with me as we're moving along. I want to make sure that the information is catered to your needs. So feel free to make this conversational. A little bit about me. I teach a number of courses here at Duke in visualizing history and culture. Do I see something coming into the chat? Ah, thank you, Kevin. And are we recording, Kevin?
Yep, we're good.
Great. I also teach a 3D modeling and animation class, an immersive virtual worlds class, which is VR authoring and thinking about virtuality in kind of a creative space. I teach sections of the digital imaging class along with my colleague Raquel. And in the fall, I'll have two new courses opening up. One is artificial intelligence in arts and humanities, which will be looking at where authorship and the role of the artist and the creator fits within a computational framework. So we'll be making things like machines that draw and paint. We'll be making image editing algorithms and using the creative and visual arts as a mode to interrogate some issues surrounding artificial intelligence. I'll also be running a course in user interface and user experience design, both at the level of technology and prototyping for, let's say, digital services and digital products, but also in terms of spatial issues and installations and art and cinema and thinking about how user experience writ large kind of covers over many components of our everyday culture. My background is that I have been teaching digital design for 15 or more years. That's the making of digital images, of products, of services. Much of this has been in design education departments and design schools, working with architects and interior designers, game designers, simulation designers. And I've also had intersecting with that ongoing artwork studies that originated really in my MFA, which I took to expand my work into the computational realm at the School of Visual Arts. I have a history with analog photography, and much of what we're going to talk about today intersects with photography, not necessarily analog, but that my roots are in analog photography. And I have extensive ongoing experience with capturing digital imagery for textures, for photogrammetry. I work quite a bit in 3D. So many of my day-to-day skills in the capturing and documentation that might be intersecting with our topics today come from that practice. I ran for 15 odd years a commercial art studio, which involved extensive portfolio and image management, which I think will intersect largely again with the talk today. So that's going to be brought to bear. And I've worked with retouchers and computer graphics studios, mostly as a technical director and a director of the computer graphics mixed in with photographic retouching. And I've certainly done, in that vein, a lot of motion and visual effects work for short films and commercials. A few slides of my work. This is an illustration that came out of my studio where we made three-dimensional illustrations for architects, developers, designers, people working in the spatial realm. So very complex, digitally born images that needed to be used in all sorts of marketing and advertising purposes. This is a collaboration with a German photographer, Holger Putin. He photographs, for this series, would photograph bystanders and pedestrians in the streets of London. And my studio created the collisions of cars happening around them. So the people and the tarmac, the the road surface are all practically photographed. The car and the collision is all computer graphics, and then these are married together in retouching. This was part of, I believe, a 10 image series that we worked on together. This is a computational artwork series that I'm currently in the process of investigating about geographies and the computational methods to model geographies and to simulate large-scale differences in kind of celestial geographies, thinking about what it means for an artist to be making a simulation of a space, of a geography that's at a great distance that we're looking at, akin to the way we look at real geographies at great distances in our lifetimes. This is another frame from that series. And then I also do quite a bit of work with history and computation. This is using a game engine, Unity, and 3D models of historic spaces, in this case, a monastery on the pilgrimage path in northern Spain, and assessing in a very quantitative way what a person, which is the tiny dot where these lines are emanating from, what a person can see as they move through this topography. So much less about the creative arts and more about using 3D to query environmental issues. So the structure of our workshop today is going to be first thinking about why do we need to document, and maybe there's some reasons that don't immediately come to mind, some benefits of taking very seriously our documentation of our work. Then we'll look at methods of documentation, photography, lighting, color, temperature, surrounding documentation of practical physical artworks. We'll discuss digital file types and preservation, how to manage and understand our options there. We'll have some examples and some hands-on work. If you have Photoshop available, we'll have an opportunity for hands-on work. Otherwise, I'll also be demoing it, but we'll use Photoshop for color correction and shape correction and cropping. And then if we have time at the end, I wanted to show you two new, relatively new tools, at least to me, from the Adobe Creative Cloud platform. Adobe Aero for augmented reality, which lends some interesting new dimensions to the notion of portfolio and documentation and showing work, and then Adobe Dimension for speculative presentations. What I wanted to stop for a moment here and hopefully do a little bit of a round robin. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, but I wanted to get a sense of who's attending this workshop and what media do you work in? Are you a painter? Are you an illustrator? Are you not a practicing artist? What needs you have? Maybe some of the challenges. So I'm going to stop my sharing, and I'm hoping that we can just take a moment and a few of you can let me know where you're coming from. And that can really help to inform this workshop. So would someone want to share where they're coming from with their work? Anyone? I see a Peter. Everyone's muted, by the way, by default coming into this session. So in order to share with us, you're going to have to unmute. Yeah, Peter.
Hey, so I am taking this class. It seemed interesting to me because I've been doing a lot of photogrammetry as well. I sort of have one foot at the Collab and then another foot at a group called Liberty Arts, which is an arts sort of collective in Durham. And I've been scanning a lot of the sculptures there to both put them on Sketchfab, and also we're working on a print to cast process with Liberty Arts. So basically, some of these sculptors work in really large formats and do big sculptures that you can sell once, but you can't really just take them down to the farmer's market to sell or anything like that.
Yeah.
So I scan them, and then we miniaturize them and print them out, and we're working on pouring them in bronze and aluminum and things like that. So
that's fascinating.
It's been super fun. But I saw your course and I thought, like half the time I'm putting things on Sketchfab or trying to put stuff on Instagram, and I thought I should see what people who know what they're doing, how they think about this process. So.
Okay, well, we'll see if I know what I'm doing. We're going to be more flat artwork oriented, but glad to have you here. And I'm not sure if you're aware, we're doing a series in between the Wired Lab and the Center for Computational Thinking on photogrammetry and practitioners in the area. We just did a showcase a week ago. So if there's a way that we can connect, it sounds like it would be really exciting to loop you in, because we've got people coming from gaming and from the hard sciences and from history, all dealing with photogrammetry and the application of that. So hopefully we can connect beyond this.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Someone else want to share? I see an Adriana who, I know Adriana. Hello, would you like to unmute and share the type of work that you're needing to document?
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, I'm Adriana. I know you too. I'm a student. I am trying to get into like graphic design, just digital work. So I'm just trying to learn more about that.
Okay, so mostly digital native files are kind of what you're going to be documenting. Fantastic. Great, thank you. Is there someone working from more of a printmaking or painting realm who's attending this workshop?
Yeah, I'm an oil painter and printmaker.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
That's great. And can I ask very briefly, and then we'll move on after you, Katya, but how do you typically document your work thus far? Not to put you on the spot, but what's your process like?
Well, so far it's been a lot of not documenting my work. If I do anything or if I need to share it with anyone, I basically just take a photo of it, because I also do photography. So I just try to make it as like high resolution of photos as I can. But yeah, that's basically all I do.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's fantastic. I think this hopefully will build around your process a little bit more. So that's very helpful for me. Let me share my screen again. Yeah. So reasons to document. And some of these may kind of smack of my personal history coming from a few decades of having to have work. One is we don't always think of it, but we might lose our work or lose access to our work or have our physical objects compromised somehow. And at this point in my career, my originals are scattered to the winds. And I didn't always foresee that when I was making them. So let's say I'm printing photographs and I am distributing them, giving them, selling them, whatever the means of distribution are. I tended to be more focused on that process early in my career than on documenting them. And then at some point it becomes too late and I can no longer document them. So I think that's a very compelling reason to be documenting at all times. Also, it's very common that we'll need to make submissions, or maybe a better way to think about this is to communicate to people who may want to invest in our work or offer us opportunities. And we want to make submissions that we are in control of, that are faithful to our work, that are not going to mislead people in what our work is built around, how it looks, what the color is. So whether that's for competitions or residencies or galleries, incredibly important. And then of course, portfolios, for print portfolios, for online portfolios, we're going to need to be clearly managing our process and managing kind of our branded entity, if you will, and how our work is communicated. And maybe along the way, we can ask ourselves, are there other reasons to document our work coming along? And I think one that I'll drop a hint towards is later in the presentation, I ask about process and documenting process and what that would mean for us. And again, early in my work, I would not document the process. I would think that only the resultant finished element, the finished, let's say, print was the artwork. And it became clear to me over time that I would often need to be able to communicate how something was made or what my process was. And that may make us think about documenting in a larger sphere beyond simply our final physical work. So the way I approached this was thinking about there are certain types of media that we might be working in. There's physical work that's flat, there's physical work that's spatial, and then there's born digital work, which we will touch on, but more from afar, in that the methods for our physical will often apply to our digital work. And when I thought about physical work that's flat, those in my mind are paintings, drawings, prints, photographic prints, collage, anything that's existing as a physical object, which is really inherently very challenging to document, especially in this day and age. And some of the issues, challenges, and considerations that I came up with is making sure that the color fidelity and that the color match between our documentation and the original work can be quite challenging, because there are so many translational technologies and pivots that happen in our documentation from the original pigment of whatever our object is to the final method that someone is viewing it. And the more that we can control that process, the better. The more that we can feel comfortable about managing that fidelity and color matching along the way is incredibly important. There's also ways to think about how do we communicate size and format, and especially if it's through an image, how is that accommodated? And I think that may come later in the workshop, but it's always a challenge for me to help people understand when they're looking at a 10-foot image in a physical, that would be in a physical gallery, or a 1-foot print that would hang on a wall. And the abstraction of the image along the way can be quite challenging for that. And then of course, faithful representation to the quality, the detail, the resolution, the way that the pigment is applied, whatever the details of the object are, being as faithful as possible to that. When I think about our methods for physical work, for flat documentation, I tend towards photography. And I think my issues surrounding that are, in COVID times at least, what's our camera device? What sort of control do we have via tripod? And what is our lighting considerations? And all of these can go tremendously wrong. I'm going to move quickly through these slides because I focus in on all of these details in much more kind of much deeper detail later. But those are some of the major components that are at work. When I think about spatial work, that could be installation or sculpture or collage. And some of the challenges are the same, but some of them are different. And what's new with the spatial work is we have more of a context often, or a location, or perhaps it's an orientation and direction, whether it's prints on a wall or an object that you can move around. What often becomes unappreciated when we're documenting the work is taking into account how are we managing that space around, especially in the case of a sculpture. Are we simply photographing it in a location that we haven't kind of queried and questioned and wondered, or are we being very intentional in the way that we're recording our sculpture? Are we putting it in a corner of a studio, or is it already there and that's where it's photographed? Or do we take time to think about what the context and the surrounding nature is of the space, and that will come into play when we're recording something that is more spatial in its component. So of course, we'll have our camera device or our capture device, tripod, and lighting. We'll discuss why we need those later, but background management for spatial. Do I have a cyclorama, meaning do I have something that is covering my floor to my wall? Am I shooting in a space that's going to allow me to focus on the sculpture? Am I using maybe paper as a cyclorama? So do I have a piece of paper that is under the sculpture, kind of peeling up onto the wall, that creates a continuous arc and radius for me to photograph against? And these are all going to be important when we think about how we're going to control the output of the final image, especially with something that's spatial, that is challenging to move, that perhaps it's an installation and it's very temporal, it's going to be taken down. We have ever more challenges in being able to go back and capture these. So we need to be thinking always not only about our immediate understanding of the work as the artist or the creator of this, but also about the viewer and the cognitive challenges the viewer might have in reading the work downstream later in the process. We have born digital or native digital work that we might need to be documenting. So that might be illustrations or digital photography, collages, retouching, computational art. Perhaps what's challenging in these is where the exact medium, whether it's a web-based drawing, whether it's something that was done in another computational method, and how that plays into our considerations in digital work. The technicalities of the color fidelity and the file types and kind of the management of those files is going to be the same as in our flat artwork. With motion work, we have to take into account the representation of time and how we're going to manage that with our process. And maybe at the end of the workshop, we can talk through, if there are those working in motion, some of the considerations of how the challenges are different when you have a motion work that extends over a period of time. And then we have interactive work, web, gaming, VR, AR, MR. What is especially challenging in these cases is combining multiple representations. So in the case of a VR project, and I've taught a number of VR studios, students are often interested in communicating what the experience in a headset is like. And so we become kind of with blinders on, no pun intended from the headset, but we have blinders thinking what the user sees is the most important component of a VR project. And often when you're communicating to a client or to a gallery or to someone who's going to want to kind of place this, they're both interested in the experience of the user, but also what is happening in the gallery as the user has their headset on. What is the experience of people waiting for this, looking at this viewer? And so the combination of both what you see in whatever this augmented gaming environment is, but then the larger context of the interaction, combining those and thinking about documenting the entirety of that process is incredibly important. We might bring this back to the spatial documentation. And if we're making an installation, we might think we only document this when there aren't people in place, but maybe showing how an installation intersects with the visitors, with the users, if there are ergonomic considerations, if there are ways that the user is being guided through the space, that can become an incredibly important component of documentation. And we shouldn't let ourselves ever have the blinders of thinking it's only about the immediate artwork, but rather there are often larger considerations surrounding the documentation. Process documentation. So by process, I mean the work that goes into, and you'll have to forgive me if you're hearing the sirens. I'm currently located in New York City, so there's a lot of background noise here. But this is the documentation of how we arrived at the project, about the process, about the building of the artwork, the making of it, maybe the process of design and consideration. And why would we want to or need to document this? Perhaps our methods are unique and there's something important in the way that we work that isn't going to be immediately apparent in the final artwork. And that could be very persuasive to certain constituencies, to certain users, galleries, people who want to support our work, that by documenting that process, maybe by having someone else helping document you in the making of your project or in stopping at various components and recording the methods that you use to make a project, it never hurts to have. And often I find it is far after the fact of creating the work that it becomes apparent to me that the process may be tremendously important to getting support from someone. And communicating to a non-specific audience. So to explain how you work, there may be times where you are looking for someone to support you and you take for granted that they understand the intricacies of the way a project works. This comes into play, especially in my more technological work and computational work, that I can't take for granted that someone understands how 3D models are made or how an algorithm is coded. And I need to provide those along with documentation of the final output. And only by including the process and the output have I truly documented in a way that works for me and that helps me and supports my work to people who I'm not even sure at the time who I'm going to be communicating this to. So let me just examples from workshop participants. Okay, so I'm not sure if this is going to work, but I was wondering if any of you had a work that you needed to document and maybe some of the issues surrounding the work presented, and is the process documentation important? So I'm going to stop my share. I have no idea if this is going to work or not, but I thought, why not? Maybe someone has a picture they've taken in form of documentation of a piece of work that they would want to share. I've enabled sharing in case anyone does. Maybe someone has nearby a picture of something that didn't turn out the way you wanted it to turn out, or is a good example of needing to consider the context of documentation beyond what you immediately thought of in the process of documenting. I'm just going to pause for a moment and see if I know I'm putting everyone on the immediate scramble to find something, but someone thinks they have some image handy or maybe a frame of a portfolio that they can put up. I think this would be really pleasant to get a sense of what some of the real issues are with your documentation. Peter, I know you were talking about photogrammetry, and I realize you might not have your images quite handy, but maybe even just a frame of a sculpture, and we can talk a little bit about what happens when you're trying to document something of this large scale.
So I am using my wife's computer and I'm getting echo. So I don't have a way to copy things back and forth.
Right.
but I do have, I mean, I have stuff on my Sketchfab account that I could shoot you a link maybe.
Yeah.
One of the problems I ran into on that, because some of what I'm doing, I'm trying to sort of also get more people interested in, like, just sort of like show liberty arts through some of the stuff that I'm doing. And so Instagram is kind of like one of the main places for that, but because they don't have a link to Sketchfab in a way that you can look at the model in 3D, for a while I was putting photos up there and people just thought they were drawings. And then I started doing little turntable videos of some of those drawings, or of some of the Sketchfab stuff, and it seemed to be getting a lot more response lately. And that's just something that I just started doing. But let me see if I can pull up an example real quick. I'm gonna open a browser.
Maybe while Peter's doing that, is there someone who has a photographed piece of documentation that they would be willing to share? Or someone can be looking for that while Peter's getting this link ready. Silence. I'll be sharing some pictures of work a little later in the workshop, so I know I'm going to be sharing some things.
It would be cool to see Adriana's oil paintings.
Yeah. Or had Katja mentioned paintings? Is that the same Katja that's on?
I think it was Katja that mentioned oil paintings.
Katja, do you have a picture of a painting that you can share with us?
I would honestly have to probably look for them. I don't have them like
Okay.
on me at the moment.
So we'll talk about that as well, because that's and I realize it's of short notice, but figuring out how to manage our files and have them on hand is incredibly important.
So I just chatted a link to one of the models that I scanned in photogrammetry.
I'm going to share my screen while I pull that up, and we can talk a little bit about this.
What this is sort of how I got into photogrammetry in the first place was our jeweler wanted a smaller version of Major the Bull, which is the bull in downtown Durham. And it's sort of like the mascot for de facto mascot for Durham. And so I had taken this class a number of years ago on photogrammetry, and I thought, well, let me take a crack at it, and generated a model for it. But then this was all prior to last June. And then last June, I was driving by and I noticed this was around the time when we were having protests and things like that. There was a ton of graffiti on Major, which was just graffiti and chalk. It doesn't hurt it or anything, but I thought it was like a really interesting intersection between what was going on in the country at the time and something that's sort of uniquely Durham. So, I took a ton of pictures. Previously, when I had scanned Major, I've run into a bunch of problems because I couldn't put up a backdrop to crop out the buildings. And so I had multiple scans, and then I was having to figure out how to get these, like how to join them together in different software projects. But this time I knew like it was going to rain and I was going to run out of time. So I needed to make sure that this was just a single pass. I took like 2,000 photos of it. And it came out better than my first scan. Because the graffiti turned out to be sort of like registration points. It gave the algorithms a lot more to grab onto. And I'm about to put out another version of Major where one of the ways that I was able to reclaim sort of all the really, really fine details that don't show up in photogrammetry was by displacing the light and dark values on the texture itself. And on this version, I can't do that with it because the graffiti obstructs that. However, I was able to then take the model, pump it back into Metashape, and place it in exactly the same place as the first model that I did. And then I retextured it with the original images and photos that I took of Major. And I was able to get the original photos onto this model. So I kind of had the best of both worlds.
So you're combining both passes in a single model.
Yeah. And so
Fantastic.
anyway, so that's a process. When you're talking about documenting your process, like I was pretty happy that that even worked. And so that's something that I want to include. I want to talk about next time I post that updated model.
Mhm.
So yeah, feel free.
I mean, I think it may be a little daunting for some of our audience who haven't encountered this sort of technical model documentation. And this is very specific to sculptures, but it's a computational process of building a model representation with the texture. And some of the affordances here are that we get to focus on the bull and interact with the bull in a way that through any single image we wouldn't be able to, right? Like we would capture an image, a photograph of it within context, which is tremendously useful as a public artwork. But if we want to focus on the bull, if your goal is to communicate the bull or this moment in time when the graffiti was happening on the bull, this method allows us to focus on that experience, right? And replicate and give agency to the user to manage their movement around this bull. And then it separates the context. It's this one mode of representation and documentation is not about bull within the city. It's about bull, and it's about bull in the graffiti and maybe the method of annotation and all of the social and cultural issues surrounding that. But I think this is a really kind of fascinating process. And I wonder, Peter, do you document, for those of us that don't know photogrammetry, we might not understand how this is made. And do you keep photographs of the process of photographing bull, so that if you need to describe what it means to take 2,000 pictures and how you have to go all the way around the bull, that having some photographs of that day when this was happening would help fill out the larger kind of broader context of this documentation?
I actually did convince one of my friends to come take a picture of me taking a picture of it.
Yeah.
Mainly because we did a presentation for an art group one time at Liberty Arts, and I needed to put some things together for it. So I did have that, but then I don't maintain like an artist website or anything like that, and I didn't have something to link it or be able to put it into necessarily like into the Sketchfab place. But yeah, I think that's a really good point. It is a process that probably most people that don't do it wouldn't necessarily know anything about, but would find interesting, I think.
Right. And maybe for those of us that are doing what we might consider more traditional arts, painting, photography, it's less easier to connect with why the process would need to be documented. That the picture of us taking a picture of our object may seem quite contrived, but if, let's say, you're shooting in a studio and you happen to be using a lighting setup that's kind of innovative somehow, or somehow kind of building a relationship within the practice about you and the object, never hurts to have that documentation. And again, I can't stress enough that in 10 years, when someone needs to understand what it meant to capture that bull, and their understanding or lack of understanding might mean getting a residency or not, them understanding that you could use their resources to complete some work, it's so powerful to have that on hand. And to your point, Peter, it doesn't fit on Sketchfab for sure, but to know that it's in your archives and that you've got that documentation of the process is fantastic. So I think maybe that's all we have for sharing. So I'm going to go back to share my screen and keep moving through this workshop. Okay, so I want to talk about photography and the setup for photography when we're documenting. In this case, it's going to be largely flat work, thinking about, I have a physical artifact that I need to document. What are my methods, especially in COVID, because we're not able to be in a studio together today, which is how we would have hopefully run this workshop, and we'll run it again in the fall where we're in a studio. So some of the major components are, we have a camera, or maybe we could call it a capture device if we were kind of feeling technical. And I thought likely that would fall into two categories. Either we would be working with our phone, which is most everyone has a phone that has a camera on it, and we take for granted that it's a method of documentation, or we might be working with a more professional or consumer camera like a DSLR, which stands for a digital single lens reflex camera. And that those are kind of our two main categories here. And while we may default to considering our phone to be a viable camera. It's often less preferable for reasons that are going to come up over and over again over the next hour or so. A major one being that we can shoot more viably a higher bit depth image, which we would call a raw image, versus a very compressed image as a JPEG with a DSLR. And that would, in my mind, tend to be a primary reason for us to think about how could we shoot with a DSLR, a digital single lens reflex camera, like a Canon camera, rather than our phone. And if we don't have a DSLR, it might seem like it's some hoop that we would need to jump through, some very kind of large outlay of expense. But I would like to note that there are such things in the photography world as rental houses. It's very common that commercial photographers don't own their equipment, but they are rented on a very short-term basis for photo shoots, both for economical reasons as well as for kind of spreading the need to have a heavy investment in cameras and keeping them up and such. And that it's quite possible if you were to plan a photo shoot for documentation, or if you were to say gather some of your peers and plan a photo shoot, that you could obtain extremely professional DSLR equipment for a day or two through a rental house at a very reasonable cost. And that when I was first getting into high resolution photography, I would often rent for a day or two at a time. And it allowed me to be using technology that was far beyond what my means were at the time. I believe also in the Rubenstein Center, we may have in the equipment cage, depending upon classes that you may be enrolled in, you have access in some classes to that cage, and there's equipment in there that could be used for documentation as well. We should think about the camera lens, which is often taken for granted if we're dealing with a phone, but if we're dealing with a DSLR, lenses are interchangeable, and we should be kind of thoughtful about how lenses work. We should always be thinking about the background or the studio or the context, about lighting, tripods, and shutter release. And I'm going to now drill in on each of these as a segment and look at them in a bit more detail. Seeing something in the chat. Okay. So for our photography setup, we're going to have a device. And if we're dealing with a phone, we are most likely going to be taking a picture that is in a compressed format, in a JPEG format, or maybe in something that's masking that compression, but it is largely a compromised file. The processing of cameras on phones makes it hard to see the compromise, but it is present in that. And I'll be showing you some examples that will expose that compromise. With the DSLR, we can shoot a raw file type, which doesn't compress the image, and that's a tremendous benefit if we're thinking about building documentation for long-term archiving, for reuse over time. We will have to deal with exposure control. So how much light is coming into our camera or not, and this is going to play a significant role in how an image is formed in the camera. With a phone camera, we won't often have a tripod mount, so it will be challenging to mount immediately our phone to a tripod, whereas a DSLR has on the very base of it a threaded adapter for tripods. Now with a phone, we could get a tripod jig, or we could otherwise kind of make or obtain a system that would help us mount our phone to a tripod, but it's not as stable as a traditional tripod mount on a DSLR. We have interchangeable lenses. So let's see, I'm holding up to my camera and I hope you can see this. This is my DSLR camera, and it's a Canon camera, and the lens is interchangeable. So depending upon my needs, I could take something that's more like a zoom lens that's going to allow me to have different focal lengths that we'll speak about in a moment, and exchange those onto the camera. And that becomes a very powerful mechanism for controlling the way that my relationship to the object is documented in the image. I will have to consider my white balance, which is dealing with the temperature of light in a studio or in the environment that we're capturing our artwork. If I'm dealing with a DSLR, there's such a thing as a sensor size for a DSLR. So there are more expensive, less expensive, often that aligns with a larger sensor or a smaller sensor. And something called a full frame sensor will be a more costly DSLR, but will provide a much more robust image for documenting my work. I can, of course, rent or borrow a DSLR. And if I am working with my phone, there are apps that are beyond our typical camera apps. For instance, the iPhone has an app called Halide that allows you to enable, or perhaps better said, emulate some features of a DSLR on a phone. So let's look at exposure for cameras and how exposure works. We generally have a triad of controls in any camera. In a phone camera, these are often masked. Some camera apps will allow you to drill down and control these very expressly. Some will mask them entirely in an effort to make the photography process seamless to you and not challenging. But we want to, in my mind, have as much control as possible over this exposure triad because it will yield the highest quality image for our documentation. We have the aperture, which is the amount of light entering our camera through the lens. And aperture is measured in f-stops. The higher the f number, the less light that's coming into our lens. The lower the f number, the more light that's coming into our lens. Correspondingly, depth of field is controlled largely by your aperture. So if you have a high f number or very little light, you're going to get a very shallow, or excuse me, a very deep depth of field, meaning you'll have in focus the majority of your frame, which when we're thinking of documenting artworks is often tremendously important. We don't want parts of our artwork to be out of focus. We want the entirety of our work to be clear and in focus and resolvable. In the case of a low f number or a very large aperture that's open, we're going to have a shallow depth of field, meaning the component that the camera is focused on is going to be in sharp focus and it will quickly fall off into a deep blur as we move away, which is not preferable for documenting our artwork. We have ISO, which is the sensitivity of our camera back or our film to light. And this traditionally was manifest in different technical film speeds, but in the case of a digital sensor, it is the sensitivity, and it's measured from a low ISO number, which is less sensitive and tends to have less grain and is preferable, to a very high ISO that moves very quickly and has high grain. So we want, for documentation, less light, lower ISO, and our last control is the shutter speed, how long a shutter is open for. And the faster the speed of the shutter, the greater the sharpness. The slower the speed of the shutter, the greater the chance of blurring. And this is where the tripod comes into play. If we are shooting at a lower shutter speed, if we're holding a camera by hand, it's going to often be soft or blurred or slightly out of focus, or even, heaven forbid, very out of focus. And that is not going to work in our favor for documenting. And all three of these are at work when we're dealing with any camera. If I pick up my iPhone, it's often being controlled by the system without my knowledge. And the system is striking a balance of, I want it to be crisp, and I want it to hopefully have as little grain as possible, and I want it to let in enough light, but I am not often allowed to control expressly what these settings are. Whereas in a traditional DSLR, I can set this camera to manual, and I can look in the controls for the camera to set very expressly the balance of light to ISO to shutter speed. This is just another sliding scale of that same information. Higher F number, sharper, lower F number, depth of field and blurrier. Shutter speed, we want to be as fast as possible. If we get into the 1/250th of a second, so this is measured in 1/250th of a second, 1/125th of a second. In this area, we're going to start to introduce blur. So if we're holding a camera by hand, we're going to be having problems if we're in this area. And if we have a camera on a tripod, we can easily be shooting at a much slower speed, but because the camera's fixed on the tripod, it's going to not have the blur that we would introduce otherwise. And then the ISO in terms of digital photography is largely noise-based. So lower ISO number, lower noise, which we'll clearly want in our documentation. The app I mentioned, the Halide app, does allow me on my iPhone to capture a slightly higher quality image off of my camera sensor. So it emulates in some ways a raw sensor of a DSLR. So if we're limited to using our phone, we ought to explore third-party applications that may allow you to have some raw capturing. So let's look for a moment at lenses. And the way a lens is measured is through its focal length, and that is the distance from the center of the optics, the convergence of the image coming into the lens to the sensor, whether that is a digital sensor for a digital camera back or whether it is analog film. This distance is the focal length. And these photos were all taken from exactly the same location with a camera. But as different lenses were used, we either see, in the case of a low 18mm, a very wide scene. So this is a wide angle lens, which is largely going to introduce more warping and distortion. And as these numbers incrementally get higher, we're zooming in and closing down our lens, and we're seeing a smaller and smaller part of our scene with less and less distortion. In the case of documenting our work, we want to err on the side of a larger lens length, because it's going to provide less distortion for our artwork. And the challenge with that is we will often need to be far enough back from our work in order to be able to capture our artwork. So it depends on the size of the painting or the size of the print or the size of the object that we're documenting. It is tremendously useful for us to use something called a color card, which I have photographed here, the front of it. And I found this, I ordered this on Amazon from a photo supply line. And this card on the front has from white to black to middle grays, different values printed, and then a number of color values printed. And I can use this in my capture process, and I'll be showing you how to do this in a little bit, to help me correct my colors on my images. And this becomes a neutral picture that captures all of the color cast within my scene. So depending on where I'm photographing and under what lighting conditions, I may have warmer light, I may have cooler light. And by photographing this card, which is a known entity, the cast of light is imbued directly into that color information. And I can use this then to kind of recolor my image automatically to bring it back to a neutral color space. On the back side of this image is a 18% gray card, which I can use again as a neutral. There's no pigment, there's no hue, let's say, in this card. And therefore, if in my image I'm getting some hue in it, I can extract that and kind of compensate for that and then bring it back to, again, to a color neutral. So this color card is going to be helpful in making sure we're matching color fidelity in our documentation. When we think about lighting for documenting our work, we want as much as possible to achieve even lighting that doesn't bias a particular side of our work. If we were in a studio together, which we will be next semester when we run this workshop, we would set up a very controlled environment where we have lights that are at 45 degrees to our artwork. We would have these lights being kind of kicking into umbrellas or other wide diffuse surfaces that help make that light not be a concentrated spotlight, but make it be a very soft wash of light that is evenly coating the surface of this artwork from both sides. We would also make sure that our camera on a tripod is entirely level and pointed into the midpoint of our artwork that we're documenting, and that we had a very controlled relationship between our camera, our artwork. All of the angles would be kind of set up in a way that we would be neutralizing as much as possible any distortion in the image. We want to make sure that we are flat into the artwork, that we are a large distance away, we are able to zoom in and focus in on that piece of artwork and remove as much as possible any distortions that would happen in our photography. We might use a setup such as this where we would control the color of the backdrop depending on what we're photographing. Again, we see these umbrellas which are serving to soften our light. So these lights are strobes, and while they're going to be very bright. They're also going to be quite focused. And this use of an umbrella, or if we're shooting at home, we could use a white garbage bag or a sheet. By shining a light into something larger and softer, it's going to diffuse that light and make it more even, and we'll have less chances of getting highlights on our artwork when we document them. This is a picture, forgive the poor picture, I grabbed this from some horrendous advertisement, but this is again a diffuser. And while this is a professional diffuser, if we had a light shining into a subject or an artwork, we could just as easily hang a sheet or other piece of fabric and shine a light through that. And it would help soften and distribute that light in a way that won't create the highlights that often compete with us when we're documenting our work. We should talk about color temperatures because not all lights are the same, and our cameras and our sensors and our color temperatures and our lights all work together in an equation that can bias our lighting and cause problems when we're trying to create a color image that is faithful to the original artwork. Color temperature is measured in Kelvin, and when we're outside in a clear blue or cloudy sky, we're at a higher degree of Kelvin. And as we move into indoors, into electronic flashes, fluorescent lights, domestic lighting, meaning a kind of traditional domestic indirect light, our color of light changes dramatically. It's hard for us to acknowledge this in person because our eye compensates and we don't see the difference in color casting when I'm outside versus inside in a space. We may have a subtle sense that our interior lights are often a little more warm than outside lights or than the sunlight, but it's very dramatic, and our brain is compensating in a way that a camera is often not going to compensate for, or a camera is similarly going to compensate for, and we need to be in control of that. And we'll see this in the case studies when we look at some images that were captured. So to recap, we want a tripod. We want that for stability. We want that for consistency. Stability because if we're shooting and we have a setup that is a low shutter speed, we're going to want to be able to have a camera that's not moving at all so that it can stay open for maybe a quarter of a second if we need that in order to capture a very deep depth of field image. Consistency if we're filming and capturing multiple artworks, that we want to be able to set our camera up in relation to our wall or our surface once and then shoot all of our artwork, and so it'll have the same consistent relationship between camera and artwork. And this also allows us potentially to have mobility while we're shooting. So if we need to be on set or on the wall or holding something up, our camera can be sitting on a tripod shooting near us on a timer or on, let's say, a shutter release, which is a way of firing off a shutter when you're not pushing a button. So you could think of a self-timer is a shutter release. DSLRs also have infrared shutter releases. There are shutter release cables traditionally you could have. And all the shutter release allows us to do is not introduce movement when we're pushing the button on a camera, whether that's a phone, whether that's a DSLR. If we are pushing on that device while we're taking a picture, we may be introducing movement. We may be moving, subtly shifting the camera, jittering it. We want to remove all movement from the photography process. So by having a shutter release, we get that sharper imaging, especially if we're dealing with large sensors and long shutter speeds and small apertures and small ISOs. These allow us to photograph in a way on a tripod that we couldn't ever photograph in person because there would just be simply too much movement in our photography. It's also worth noting that it's common these days to shoot tethered, meaning many DSLRs allow you to connect directly to an application in a laptop while you're shooting. And that takes the guesswork out of understanding whether you've captured the image you need when you have your setup in place. So for instance, next semester, when we're all back in one studio shooting, I would want to set it up tethered. So when we brought our artworks in, we weren't looking only at the small LCD on the back of our DSLR, but we would have a big monitor set up next door on a laptop, and we'd be able to, as we shoot and as we document, really zoom in and make sure we're absolutely comfortable and confident with the way we're documenting. Because maybe that painting is going to hang in a gallery or get sold or somewhere be out of our domain for photography. We need to make sure that we are confident with our documentation. But this is the COVID edition, and we don't have access to a studio. And when I was creating the content for this workshop, I also didn't have an access for a studio, and I don't really have space for lights in my apartment. So at the minimally important is when I'm thinking about how do I photograph in my environment that's not a studio, I need to distinguish the differences between a space that's best for photography and a space that's best for hanging artwork. And I think often when we're new to documenting, we don't distinguish between those effectively. And we might think that where I hang my artwork is a natural place for me to document my artwork, but I'm going to propose that's not the case. And I walked around my apartment, and I'm going out on a limb here, kind of showing the way I live, but I documented a little bit of artworks that I have hanging. And while I think of these as being well hung and well lit and enjoyable experiences in my own life, if I were to think of documenting work in this location, I can see that I have a shadow that I'm casting on this artwork. Moreover, there's glass, of course, that's problematic on this artwork, but I have strong light coming from the right-hand side, I have less light coming from the left-hand side, and I have a shadow that's covering the artwork. All of these would become enormously huge problems in my documentation. And the images that I gathered, just gonna wait for that siren to pass. The images that I gathered would all have these same problems burned into them. And so this is not a good place for me to document. I thought maybe where I hung artwork on a wall in my apartment would be a good place on a larger wall. And what I can see is on the left, I have a warmer light. And on the right, I have a cooler light. The right-hand side is coming from some windows. The left-hand side is coming from an indirect chandelier. This is not a good place to photograph because I have two colors of light entering the scene. So then I moved outside and I thought, I have an overcast day. Maybe I can get a space that is not traditional for hanging art, but would allow me to photograph art that would be very, very even. The same way that those two lights coming in from 45 degrees is trying to make a very even studio lighting condition. Can I use an overcast day in the shade to give me even lighting? And this was in an alley where it's looking promising, but I had an open area to the left and a closed area to the right. So I was worried that I would have a stronger light coming from one side than the other. And so then I found an area kind of facing the front street that I thought I could use that didn't have much of a bias one way or the other. It did have a balcony over it, but I'm thinking this area here would work well for photography. And while this is rather ridiculous to be taking this beautiful photo print on board that I've had for decades and placing it outside my apartment, seemed very unconventional, but I would argue this is quite an appropriate place to be documenting it because I'm not mixing different lights. I don't have warm interior light and sunlight. I don't have light coming more from one side to another. This image is actually oriented out towards an overcast day, very even lighting. It was a gray morning. And I think this is an ideal location to be photographing that artwork. And in my mind, I am removing everything else around it. And let's go in a little closer. I'm removing all of this knowing that in my documentation, I'm not interested in the background information. I'm only interested in my artwork. So I've shot it here with my 18% gray card, the backside of my card. I've shot it here with my color card, and I've shot it without either of those. And we're going to use some of those images like this setup here in a moment to look at how we can bring these into Photoshop and begin to color adjust, make sure we're very confident about the color balance and the color cast, and have documentation that's perhaps more accurate than it has been in the past. So a little bit of a cheat sheet for our photography. Ideally, we'd have something, a full frame DSLR. We'd set it to manual so that we can be very consistent with our exposure. We would have a very closed aperture with a high f-stop. We'd have a low shutter speed for long exposure. We'd have low ISO. We'd have very controlled even lighting like I had outside. A white balance set properly in the camera. So if I'm shooting in a certain quality of light, I would look at my camera, and a DSLR is going to let me set that to be, I'm outside on a shady day, I'm in full sunlight, I'm inside in more tungsten interior lighting. I would set that appropriately. And I would shoot with that color card. I'd be on a tripod and I'd be on a shutter release. If I don't have a DSLR, at least I'd have my camera phone at the highest resolution setting. I would, of course, be in a controlled, even lighting environment from only one temperature. And I'd set that white balance, and I would also actually shoot with that color card. So let's talk for a moment about file types before we get into color correction, because if we're documenting our work into digital file types, we need to understand the difference of some of these file types and what's happening under the hood. And we may or may not have been exposed to this in our past. And the reason why we need to understand these is they vary tremendously in how they degrade our image, how faithful they are to the original capture off of the camera sensor for our image. Also, when we're talking about file types, we want to think about preservation, technology access, persistent storage, and different types of files, whether they're editable or collapsed or thumbnails, and being equipped with a strategic approach to our documentation through file management. So this is a picture of that photograph on a board. The photograph itself is very soft and has a number of scratches in it. So these are not errors we're seeing. This is the original artwork, had this soft focus to it. And these are two JPEGs. This is a JPEG at high resolution and a JPEG at low resolution. And at first blush, it seems like a JPEG, which we're maybe commonly associated with our phone devices and with being able to share images, is perfectly appropriate for documenting our work. However, when we get in close to the JPEG, you may be able to see that there is some artifacting that happens when we look in detail at JPEG files. And this is going to make us hopefully always consider whether a JPEG should ever be introduced into our workflow. And I found it a bit challenging to see in that photograph, so I moved on to a different photograph. And this is a photograph of a storefront in Bushwick, Brooklyn, very high detail. The difference between a uncompressed and a compressed image, very hard to tell when we're looking at this from afar. But when we start to get in close, we can begin to see some color casts and some challenges in our image with the JPEG. And when I get in even closer, maybe you can begin to see that there is some magenta and yellow shifting, and there is some blockiness that begins to emerge. And if we move around this image and we look in another portion, we can begin to see the structure of blocks overlaid on our image. And this is a very, very low quality JPEG, so I'm exaggerating the problem, but it happens whenever a JPEG file is saved. So what's happening under the hood, and this is the original image without JPEG, and that's with JPEG. What's happening is that the JPEG file format is reducing dramatically the amount of information while trying to capture enough variation in tone to feel photographic. So instead of capturing every pixel, it is sampling into blocks of color. It is taking your traditional red, green, and blue 3 channels of color and compressing that into only 2, chroma and luminance. So essentially, it's stripping away information and trying to look as much as possible like the original image. And while that works when we're sharing images for casual use, if we're documenting our work, we don't ever want our work to have been stripped down. We don't ever want a loss of information about our artwork. What we would much rather have is a faithful recreation of our artwork. And this is all about file types and all about understanding what file types we should be choosing when we're documenting. This is an even more exaggerated. So I saved this several times as a JPEG. So I opened it, saved it, opened it, saved it. Every time I save a JPEG file, it introduces more and more compression. And over time, over maybe 3 or 4 savings, this is what my image looks like. And while from a great distance, it may still look faithful, this is not the type of image I would want to archive when I'm documenting this work. I need to be fundamentally far more faithful to my image. I want to share this because this is one of my earlier images in my career. And this issue of file types and of file management came into play recently when I was going back and trying to showcase some early works from my career. And not as much the issue of JPEGs, but maybe more the issue of persistence and how we deal with our digital file types when we're storing them. So this image is from 1998. I think it was one of my early digital images, I was working in an architecture firm. And I noticed that when I zoom in close on it, the only image that I had saved was a JPEG and was fairly low detail, and that I also didn't have a great location for saving my digital images at the time. And it means that when I look back on a year's worth of work, and maybe I would now have much rather stored a full resolution, non-compressed image, what I'm left with is the choice that I made at that time. And so I think we want to be considering when we're documenting what our needs might be in the future, and that by saving higher fidelity and a greater number of images, and also being very cognizant of the location of these images, where we're saving them, whether we're saving them in a cloud system or we're saving them on a physical hard drive, managing that and making sure we have accessible to us our images is tremendously important. This is another image that I had taken. This was of a physical installation in a gallery that I had created. And at the time, I had just saved a JPEG scan of a print, I believe. And we can see that there's a tremendous amount of blocky compression here. And because this was an ephemeral installation that disappeared a few weeks after it went up, and this is the only documentation I have, many years later, I'm stuck with what the decisions were at the time that I made. And so thinking back on that, I would have been more focused on the documentation and storing files that would be useful to me later, that would hold up at greater fidelity later, that I could print and distribute at a larger volume later than what I ended up with. So for the file types, the cheat sheet is, rather than using a JPEG file, there's a file type called a TIFF, and the file type that is native to Photoshop, that's a PSD. These are both largely, we can consider them uncompressed, and these are far more appropriate for archiving and for documentation of artworks. In addition to that, we want the highest resolution and the highest color depth possible. We want to be careful to think about universal file formats. The benefit of this TIFF file is that it has been around, the code base for it has been around for decades, and many programs can open and save TIFF files. Some programs that may have very particular file formats to them, the challenge might be that if that is what you're saving for your documentation, if you find yourself 5 years later and that company has gone out of business and you no longer can access those files, it's tremendously problematic. So erring on the side of an uncompressed, large universal file format like a TIFF makes abundant sense when we're thinking about documentation. Cloud storage, or the location of storage and how accessible these files are, is also important, that when years later we want to send our work or share our work or recover or make prints, that we need to be thinking about that at the point of documentation. How and where are we going to save these files in order to maximize their availability and utility to us? We may also want to think about a thumbnail for specific uses. So if I have a high quality documentation and I am needing to send out to many galleries or submissions small images to use, maybe I will save both a large scale image and a small scale image so that I have readily on hand the documentation that I would need, not only for my portfolio, but also for distributing, and that I wouldn't often want to distribute the large scale format image because I'm then giving kind of the rights to replicate that image in some ways, or the ability to replicate it. And I want to think about, what am I going to be distributing and how can I use my management of files to help that process? So I'm going to demonstrate now kind of pushing files out from Photoshop, thinking about resolution, format, compression, in case you haven't encountered this before. I'm going into Photoshop, going to open, let's open one of these images. So in Photoshop, under my image size, I can see the resolution measured in pixels of my image. So this is a 5,000 by 5,000 pixel image. This is a digitally native image. And in order to save this out, even though, let's just assume it's not a JPEG, if I were to choose a TIFF file or a PSD file, these are going to be universal file formats that are still rather up to date and common. you'll notice there are many file formats you can save in. Not all of these are as common as TIFF and PSD. For instance, the IFF file format, which we hopefully wouldn't be tempted to save in, but is a very particular file format that may not be accessible to us over time. Likewise, the BMP is falling out of favor. So we want to be very careful about considering how we save these. If I were to make a TIFF file, let's call this geography documentation. When I save a TIFF, I am able to, under image compression, say no image compression. Heaven forbid I were to ever choose JPEG, I have actually undone the hard work of saving this into a TIFF, and I would then introduce JPEG compression. LZW and zip compression doesn't change the pixels, but makes the image file packed down. So it would take longer to open and close, but is not going to compromise visually the image. But I'm going to choose none. And this is going to allow me to save a very high fidelity image that I can open in many other programs. If I were to save as a PSD, it is natively saving it, won't ever allow me to introduce any compression into that. So that's another option. If I were to want to make a thumbnail of this image, so something that I could distribute without sending the full res image out, I could take my image size, perhaps dial this down to 1000 pixels. So I have a version of my artwork that quickly shows that it's pixelated. And so I'm not worried about distributing the large scale work that could be duplicated or printed out, but I could use this to communicate to someone very easily what my artwork is about. And maybe this I would save as a JPEG, because this is not my archival documentation. This is geography documentation thumbnail. And by saving this as a separate file, I would know that it is not something that I would ever print from. It is only something that is compressed and lossy and problematic in some ways, but very easy to send and distribute to people that need to see my work. This quality slider allows me to choose how little or how much compression. And the example I was showing you where the blocks were quite pronounced and problematic was in the lower end of the compression. So you'll see that if I choose a quality that is low, it is going to yield a smaller file, and it gives you a sense of the file size. And if I were to choose larger, it's going to give you a larger file size, but higher quality. So I'm going to choose this as the maximum file size. And so what I have now is I've taken that artwork and I've made two versions. I've made a version that is archival as a TIFF file format, and I've made a version that is a thumbnail that is appropriate for sending out to for casual use and understanding what my work is about. Let's look at the digital image workflow. So we're going to get into actually making some demonstrations of how we can adjust using that shot documented artwork into Photoshop and using that color card. So I'm going to demonstrate importing a JPEG and using curves to color correct the image. So let's open. I'm going to open an image that I have labeled incorrect white balance. And this was not shot in a great location. So this was one of the locations I was testing. And while at the time when I was looking at the artwork, I didn't realize this, what you can clearly see is there is a wash of light. There's far more light coming from the right-hand side than the left-hand side. And this is something that I wouldn't use this piece of documentation because of that. I don't want to be fighting with incorrect lighting, but this is going to be a great way to demonstrate how this color card can help us correct this image. So I'm going to make a new adjustment layer of type curves. An adjustment layer in Photoshop doesn't change permanently the underlying layer. It is editable, so I can choose whether or not I want to keep this adjustment. And what I see in my adjustment layers, I can sample a black point. So if I click on this sample black point and click on the black point on my card, it adjusts the colors of my image to make that pure black. And if I were to sample my white point, it is going to make that color pure white. And then if I sample a mid gray here, it is going to set my gray point. So what's happened with that card, if I turn off the layer, this adjustment layer, this is what I had before, which was very warm, overly warm. My image of my artwork was incorrect, not faithful to the color of my image whatsoever. This is far more faithful. And when I compare this to the original artwork, which I'm not going to take off the wall, but this is a far more faithful representation. And the way I know that, the way I have confidence in that, is this simple color card that cost a few dollars to purchase allows me to automate this process in Photoshop and use it to calibrate my colors, because this white, that black, and these grays had embedded in them the same color cast that's happening in the room. So that's a very powerful mechanism for calibrating our color. Let's do this on another even more dramatic image. I have an image that I shot under the wrong, absolutely wrong color white balance. This was an image that was shot in a room with indirect light, and it was set to being, it was in a room with daylight, and it was set to have a color balance for indirect lighting. And while this isn't an artwork documentation, it is a picture of my card. So I'm going to use the same method: layer, new adjustment layer, curves. Set black point. That little gray blob is actually my black, and set white point. This deeply blue swatch is actually my white, and my midpoint is in here. And so now, of course, I have a layer that I can turn on and off, or that I could, let's say, scale down if I wanted less of. I could change the opacity of that layer. This has now corrected my color space such that pure white, pure black, and pure gray is being represented. So that's quite a dramatic change in our color space. And hopefully this persuades you that if we have taken the time to set up our camera's orientation, direction to our artwork, we have a lens that is trying to focus in dramatically on that artwork and frame it effectively, that we can then use these cards to take care of our color space to manage it. I'm going to show you one more example of this, because it's not abundantly clear what we do if the card is blocking our artwork. And I'm going to load these 3 images. And I'm going to combine these images together. So I'm going to take this image that was shot with the card, and I'm going to duplicate. Let me select all, edit, copy, and I'm going to paste it into this artwork image. So I'm combining 2 images in one. And it doesn't matter that they don't overlay effectively, because what's important is they were shot in the same location with the same light and color space, which is rather well calibrated. These images were shot in that outdoor condition. They were shot kind of well orchestrated such that the lighting is not far off. But I'm going to go ahead and make a new adjustment layer, curves. I'm going to set my black point by clicking on black, set my white point by clicking on white, and set my mid gray. And now I can turn off the layer with my card. And what I have is a very subtle correction. If I turn off that correction, I can see what was white paper at the time, and a fairly bright paper is rather dull. And when I turn on that correction, it's just brightening up and adding contrast based on those light and dark values to create a higher fidelity image. Now notice there's some challenges with this image in that I wasn't looking directly into the artwork, so we need to solve that because I have an image that's skewed. So let's go back to okay, I'm going to open up these images here. These images are a little bit more intentional. I'm going to copy the image of this artwork with a color plate into this image. Again, I'm going to make a layer, new adjustment layer, curves, black point, white point, mid gray. And then let's go ahead and correct this image. My registration was not great here because I'm not shooting on a tripod, but let's go ahead and look at how we can align this image more effectively within frame. And so the steps I'm going to do that would be to isolate the image, and I'm going to copy it up onto a new layer. So I've just kind of gotten rid of my background. I've copied a rough crop of the artwork up onto a new layer. I'm going to use my rulers. In Photoshop, I am showing my rulers. I'm going to drag a guide. So I'm clicking on my vertical ruler and I'm dragging some guides out so I can get my verticals and my horizontals. I'm going to get my horizontals by dragging on my horizontal ruler. And this gives me some framework to alter and adjust my image around because it's not representative of the orthographic artwork as it was presented in its physical form. And I'm going to, with that layer selected, edit, transform, distort, and I can now grab corners and distort this image and just correct some of the distortion that came from the lens of my camera. And much of this was because I was shooting on, in this case, on a phone that was very highly wide angle and distorting my orientation of my artwork. So it kind of created some problematic issues surrounding the size of my artwork and the verticality and orthographic lines of it. If I were shooting on a DSLR on a tripod, I would have been able to refine this to get rid of that. I'm going to say okay. And now I'm going to, let's see, adjust my guide slightly. And I'm going to finally crop this image. So I will use my cropping tool and select snap to these edges of these guides. And then under image, crop. So now I have, if I deselect, I have an image that is that artwork that has that proper color correction placed onto it using the cards. And I can get rid of these layers that I wasn't using. And I could save this as a TIFF file. Let's call this Dorn, who's the photographer, Dorn Mountain Documentation. I'm going to turn off my layers. In Photoshop, I was working with some layers. If I turn these off, it's going to collapse this into a single, more universal image. I have to be careful that I'm comfortable with my layers that with my color correction. So let me make sure that I'm comfortable with that. If I wanted to be able to come back and edit this image again, I could save a version that was also a PSD, and maybe I would call this editable and leave layers on. And finally, I'm going to take this image and make a small size, call this thumbnail. I'm going to save this out as a thumbnail. And if I put these all into a folder, let's call this Dorn. Oops. What I have is I have a PSD that is editable that I could open, and it would have my layers, my color correction, so I can go back and continue to make changes to that image. I have my thumbnail that is a low quality JPEG. It's small in size. It is not an artwork I would use for printing or for submitting to final judgment, but it would be a way that I could communicate quickly, efficiently attach this in emails and such. And then I have my TIFF file, which is a single image, uncompressed, fairly large in file size. That is my final documentation of that artwork. So I have three here that serve three kind of different purposes depending upon how I'm conceiving of the future of this piece of artwork and maximizing my opportunities to effectively kind of use these pieces of documentation once my artwork has been created or is no longer accessible to me. We can also use a raw file shot on a DSLR to correct in a slightly different way against the back of that color card. So I want to show you how we would do that in Photoshop. And the raw file type is available from our DSLRs or from, in the case that I'm going to show you, our Halide app on the iPhone. And it allows us to capture more information from our sensor, which is, when we're documenting our work, always preferable. So I'm going to open, let me first show you a raw image that is not one that I took, but shows kind of the great opportunities with raw. When you open a raw image in Photoshop, you get a different ingestion tool. It's called Camera Raw, and it allows you to make a number of adjustments before you've imported the image. And it highlights some of the features of raw images. You may have noticed that when I looked at that raw image, it looked very dark and underexposed. And yet when I open it in Camera Raw, it looks relatively well exposed. And what this shows us is I can change the exposure because of the amount of information captured by a raw image. If I were to take this slider labeled exposure, I can underexpose the image, I can overexpose the image. I have quite a huge amount of light information that goes beyond traditional digital photography that allows me to finesse my exposure. And it's really powerful. It allows me to correct for more issues after I've taken my photo than I can with traditional digital photography. If I pick an image that is raw that has my card in it, let's see, what am I looking for? I'm looking for this image. So I have my middle gray card and it has some reflective properties on it. I'm going to pick the area that is not reflective. And I look at white balance. I can use this white balance tool and click on an area that's gray. And what has happened is it just adjusted and dialed in my temperature and tint to make sure that that gray, that the hue in it was neutralized. So it gives me a correction of temperature and of tint that compensates for that, for the white balance skewing. So let me cancel that and let's look at this one more time by opening up a fresh version of this file. It's going a little closer. So my temperature by default, as shot, my camera was reading a temperature of 5750 and a tint of 15. And if I click to auto white balance, it actually corrects it to 6004. And so I can use that if I were to open this image and then I were to open an image that doesn't have that card, I can dial in those settings. And I'm getting a greater level of compensation in my raw file. So what was it, 6,000? And forget what the number was, 7. And so I used the color correction that I got in that card with the automatic white balancing to then be able to white balance this image. So I'm using that as a tool to eradicate the color cast in this documentation. And again, the benefit with RAW, it's hard to see this and appreciate it just with our visual optical sensation, but there's significantly more information coming in with a RAW image. And so we are pushing less problematically the values of the pixels in compensating for that color. So I think the next slide, I was going to suggest an interactive component where I share a drive that has some of this information in it. So maybe I can put this in the chat, and that if it made sense that some of you could go into Photoshop on your ends and create some of the same. The thumbnail didn't change the image size. No, I don't know when that, sorry, that chat went in. When I made the thumbnail size, I was intentionally setting a smaller image size. And I was thinking more as someone managing my artwork that I wanted to know and be able to identify a smaller image that I would not be worried about sending out a full res image when I sent anything labeled as a thumbnail. So I've just shared in the drive a folder that is a Google Drive folder, and it has in that drive, if you're interested, the example raw file, the 2 incorrect white balance files that were shot with the card. It has the sequence of photographs taken with the JPEG sequence taken with the card, and it also has a raw sequence taken with a card. So I'm going to show you one more time, maybe this very dramatic blue cast image and how I resolved that. And if you want to, you can follow along or open these up on your end. In a moment, once I've done this, I'll stop sharing and kind of pause and check in, see where we are. I'm going to open that incorrect white balance. This is a very dramatic problem in this image. And my process is to make under layer a new adjustment layer, curves. And then I use these 3 buttons, the pick, set black point, set gray, and set white point. This is my black, this is my white, my gray. I believe I can pick either of these in the middle, but I'm primarily interested in this black and this white, which it's going to read the pixel values and then push that to white and push this to black, which is then going to compensate across my entire image. So I click on set black, I click on set white, click in the middle, which is going to be a very small compensation. And what we're seeing in this curves is that my red channel has been adjusted to create the fidelity of the color matching. My green channel has been adjusted and my blue, and they haven't been adjusted all the same way. They've been pushed in different ways to allow me to then have an image that dramatically returns my color balance in the image to something that should be more faithful to what the physical realities of the documented artwork were. So I'm going to stop the share. I see one thumb up. Not sure, we've lost a lot of people along the way. Which mid-gray are you using? You know, I'm using both of them and they seem to be making such slight differences that it's the dramatic white and black that I'm using or is doing the major correction. And I apologize, but I'm new to this card, so I am not sure yet if there is a, well, that's because of my blurry background, not going to show. So let me change my video settings so it's no longer blurry. Didn't realize that. What's happening? None. Okay, there we go. I'm not sure calculation-wise the benefit of one over the other one of these. The backside is pure 18% gray, and I believe this might be my 18% gray here, but the dramatic change is happening with the white and black. And, you know, we can clearly take this logic much further as we're color correcting, and we have different tones that are documented here that are associated with various color recipes. And on the back of my card, it's giving me lab measurements and CMYK measurements. Not that I would ever want to be converting to CMYK prior to going into print, but it gives me some color calculations for all of the colors that are present. So I can do a very comprehensive testing in my image of putting, let's say, a pure red and a pure yellow over, and being able to then have some confidence that the artwork images I'm taking are corresponding to this real measurement card. And that's kind of the big takeaway for me from thinking about how we document our physical work. So I'm not sure if you are following along or not. I have a feeling AD is, we have two paths here, and it's been kind of a long workshop already. I was going to show the notion of using augmented reality to place artwork within space, as not as a specifically common way of thinking about documenting our work, but when I think in terms of COVID, of if I'm making a 6-foot piece of artwork and I can't hang it in a gallery, how can I share some of that experience? I have a little demo, short demo of using Aero to allow someone else on another end of this process to simulate that experience within their space. And then I was also going to kind of drop the idea of using the program Adobe Dimension, which is a very accessible 3D application, as a way of removing the abstraction from our images and situating them within a fictional gallery, and giving someone the sense of this is how I would intend to display something. Because again, we don't have room and access to our galleries to actually be showing our work. So it can be very powerful to be able to create maybe not the illusion of how we're staging our artwork, but the intention of how we would want to place our artwork. And I'm not seeing a whole lot of feedback, so I think I'm just going to keep going with that. And I'm going to try to be cognizant of our time here. We have 20 minutes. So I might be powering through these, but I think it'll be an interesting few more steps. So to go back to this present. So Adobe Aero is augmented reality, which until recently was quite possible, but a heavy technical load to author an augmented reality app. And Adobe has begun to offer, still primarily in beta, an app that allows you to have limited augmented reality access with the universal kind of workflow that we expect from Adobe. And it's exciting because it allows you to simulate space and some object interaction and think about a virtual user experience. And there's a link here, which actually, if you wanted to, while I'm presenting, load Aero onto your phone, I'm going to just copy that link in. You ought to be able to send yourself this link if you want to load Aero and be able to experience what I'm going to be showing here. So Aero is a very simple workflow. You bring in props or objects or artworks. You choose whether you want those to be located on vertical surfaces, on horizontal surfaces, or from a marker that is an image that is recognized. And essentially this process is, where do you want the user to be able to place whatever the object is they're going to see in their camera? Should it be on the wall, which in my case, I'm presenting a notion of a piece of art that's on a wall. Is it an object like the bull maybe that's going to be on a flat surface at a certain scale? Or is it something that you want to be able to travel with a marker? And so I made this a vertical surface, and I had set the size of this object to be, I believe it was 2 meters in each dimension. And then in the Adobe Aero app, so these are screen captures from my phone running the app. When I open the link, I'm prompted to scan my room, move my camera side to side, and it looks for a vertical surface. It knows that this app, this experience that I've authored, indicated vertical surfaces are important. So it's looking, as I scan the scene, it's looking for a vertical surface that it can pinpoint. And it's doing that through sampling image algorithms and looking for consistent details as the camera moves. And then it allows me to tap and place this object. And as I move around my room from one side to another, it is persistently locating that object. And you may say not entirely persistently. If I look at the left image and the center image, the relationship of the artwork to the painting is not quite precise, but it's rather compelling that as you move around, your camera is understanding its recognition and its location in relationship to that wall surface or that floor surface or that marker. And it is going to allow someone to understand what the experience, not what the experience, but maybe what a experience of this work object would be like. And it allows them to then understand their kind of embodied relationship to that object. And the way this works in the authoring application is generally, here's my object. It already has a texture applied to it. And I brought this in from a very simple 3D kind of application where I had applied this as a texture. It has a vertical surface. It has a certain size. I see it was only 3 feet in each direction. So I could change the size of the object. I can change its relation to the place that it is located in space. And whenever you as a user click on a vertical surface in your room that the app has identified, this object at that size will show up until you close out of that app. So it's a little bit of a novelty, but rather intriguing in how it can recreate perhaps some of the experience of understanding how an artwork would persist in a space. Adobe Aero also allows you to add some limited functionality, in meaning you can make an object clickable, you can make things, simple changes happen over time, like an object change in scale, get smaller, make an object appear or disappear. It's very limited because it's trying to be universal across all phone platforms, which is what's exciting and challenging about it, is that you have some assurance that it's going to work on any modern phone that's running either Android or iOS, which has traditionally been a bit of a hurdle in how you make augmented reality accessible to wide numbers of users. But that's one of the topics I wanted to show at the end. And the last one was something called Adobe Dimension, which is a 3D modeling and rendering, more of a rendering application than a modeling application. And it's also about simulating space and object interaction, but maybe more about presentation and hanging and user experience, and how, if I have an artwork that would be of a certain size and I wanted to suggest the way it would be in a gallery, and not having access to actually photographing it in a gallery, in a context with a wall. You know, we've just been talking about photographing the work itself as a flat, cropped, color-corrected experience, but rather thinking about how it fits into the larger domain of hanging. Dimension is a quite accessible tool for mocking up relationships of models, artwork, walls, floors. We can bring in and import models. So for instance, when we saw, was it Peter's bull model, that could be brought into Adobe Aero for augmented reality, could be brought into Adobe Dimension, and it allows us to create the notion of what an experience might be, to paint a picture for someone of how could this hang, how could this appear, what is the intention of this artwork in its relationship to architecture and relationship to the body. And to demonstrate briefly that, I have here this scene with a floor, with a wall, again with an artwork. I have a camera that I can place very precisely. Ooh, ooh, ooh. Something went wrong. I got lost here. Let me just frame selection. I can place this camera according to its location in Cartesian space. I can change its field of view. So again, this is not moving the camera, but just like we spoke about with a DSLR, being able to change the angle based on the lens that you're using, we can zoom in closer, we can go further back, and then ultimately we can render this, which if we were to render, this is the process of building a picture of this artwork in this environment. And while this is a super subtle distinction, I think for many of us, the soft cast shadow that I'm seeing on this wall, the ability to eventually have a floor to show a series of images next to each other, it's creating the illusion of artwork in space in a way that's very challenging. When I'm thinking I'm in my apartment in Brooklyn and I have 3 or 4 6-foot images that I want to study in a gallery, and I want to send to a gallerist or a curator and say, this is the way I want this work to be hung. This is what it could be if you were to accept it. This is how it would be presented. That by being able to build that experience in one of these applications and render it, and instead of having just my documentation of my artwork, I now have an image that represents what that larger experience would be. can be very powerful, and I think can fill in the blanks of ways that we would otherwise want to be staging our work and being able to maybe more traditionally document it in a staged gallery environment. So again, this is rendered. It's a 3D rendering. It has a very subtle drop shadow because this canvas for this object is proud of the wall. And it looks like I had lost my floor in there when I quickly, hastily staged my camera. If I were to render again from a different vantage point, I can begin to get floor, which could be textured. I could take this very far with lights and textures and other information in the facsimile and simulation of the scene in order to kind of build a larger experience. So I think that, have I not been sharing my screen? Did no one say anything?
I thought it was just me. I was trying to open that link, but it's on my, let's switch it to computers.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Your description was great though.
Well, where did I drop you off with the arrow? Did you see the arrow mock-up?
No,
See that?
sorry, I thought you were just describing it. We were following along on our phone.
All right, yeah, no problem. I think I'm sharing now. The
Yes.
augmented reality application allows you to drop into a view of your room, this artwork. So it's essentially allowing me to have someone else through the app experience what an object might be in their space. So it allows them to understand the size and the implication, and as they move through their space, their relationship with the camera is updating to show this artwork. So it can be a very compelling way of bringing our work into someone else's environment. And then this Adobe Dimension application is not interactive, but is about rendering an experience of what a gallery condition could be like. So in this case, I have a wall, a floor, and a piece of artwork. And if I were to render that, it is not interactive again, but it may allow me to begin to show someone how I would envision staging my work, how I would envision it being in a gallery. It has a drop shadow. It begins to be a facsimile of a physical experience rather than a virtual experience. And those are two ways of extending our image-based documentation to kind of bring it a little bit back towards reality, either back towards that notion of what it would be in a gallery or to that notion of what it would be in someone else's space, so they can actually experience it beyond simply seeing a flat artwork, but having a way of representing it where they're able to kind of move around and feel like they understand the implications of what the size and dimensions of the artwork would be. So that was where I was going to end it. That was a long and arduous 2 hours, but hopefully there were maybe some kernels of interest in there. To me, coming from a traditional documentation background, the incorporation of a card and the incorporation of being able to automate the process of color correcting and not trying your best and wondering where you're getting there is incredibly powerful. And I think that if that's the takeaway that someone documenting more traditional work takes from this, that's worth everything that we've been doing for 2 hours.
Yeah, that was a really helpful method. I actually just ordered one of those cards. That's not something I've used before, but
yeah, powerful stuff.
Can I ask a couple, or whenever you're ready for?
Yeah.
I was curious if you knew of any service or app or anything like that that was doing location-based augmented reality yet, at least for like a virtual gallery outdoors.
So, okay, a few ways of approaching it. The beauty of Adobe Aero, it's kind of still buggy and it's problematic, but any of us that have worked with the Adobe applications and known that we could lean heavily on them, that excites me, that we're going to be able to lean heavily on Aero. And the fact that it can use a marker, which is essentially a picture, it's one way of making geographically aware. If you had that marker persistent in a tag, graffiti, or really sanctioned or temporary plaque or whatever it is, that would be a way, without having to actually be geolocated, to make yourself geolocated. There are for game engines such as Unity, which is a super powerful tool for augmented reality, you can connect to Mapbox, Google Maps. Through APIs, you can make, the phone already knows where it is. You can use that to trigger experiences that are local to that space, but the order of magnitude of technical coding and development goes up really far. And I think there are a number of providers that are looking for making persistent objects, but they're not universal yet. So both iOS and Android have the ability for persistent markers that know where they are in space. So theoretically, you can return and conjure up the same experience someone else has had. But I think last time I had looked at it, Android was limiting that to maybe 24 hours of persistence. So it's close to being available, but I haven't found a single kind of key element to it. I do know that a number of people in the Durham area are interested in hosting persistent experiences. So for instance, if it's something that you want to be working on locally, we've got people from Heritage and people from the arts world who are looking for the right method. In fact, we're developing in our lab a Heritage app that, while it's not augmented reality, as you move through space, it triggers and feeds you content about that space, which is mostly, in our case, is about different readings of history. So as you move through a historic location, you can get prompted interactions and choose whose version of history do I want to hear? What reflections do I want to hear about this space? And it's, again, not spatially augmented, but it's using your GPS to like hit you with ideas when you enter into a space.
Oh, that's really interesting.
In a class that I've run recently, we were using our own models, much like, for instance, the bull model in Aero, and it was quite powerful in how students were able to bring these artifacts into these virtual experiences that are super distributable, right? Like you can send, while we're trying to open this link at a moment in a workshop, with it all orchestrated properly, it can be distributed. You can have QR codes, and you can have many, many people experiencing a story of that bull in their own environment. Not always, there are affordances and problems with that, but it's a powerful notion when you think of being able to send that out as a marker, as a kind of, as an element to large numbers of folks. I'm
definitely gonna look more at Aero. I hadn't played with it yet. I tried, Sketchfab had they have a built-in AR thing, but they don't do the lighting. So the way that you render it with inside the web page looks totally different than when it renders in your room, and different in a bad way. So
yeah,
I wasn't real happy with their product, but I'll probably play around with more of that as well.
Yeah. And what I hope with Adobe is, since it's in beta, that it will only continue to get more deep kind of support from them over time, and that it will begin to be able to hinge into more of the specific features for each of the two sets. What's really challenging with AR is you've got the Apple development, iOS development stack, and the Android development stack, and they're competing. So they can both do similar things, but to be able to access them both, you have to make a universal approach, and then you can't access something that isn't supported on the other. It's still a bit of a domain problem.
I had another question, but it might be going way off script.
Go for it.
A couple of times I've tried to do conceptual drawings for artists when they're doing an application process. And I was wondering in my mind, what I'd like to be able to create is, they had an object that was going to be at a location, and I'd like to be able to have somebody just like walk around and navigate it. And it was sort of like AR, but VR. And I kind of I didn't get that close to that, but I was able to produce the object and then, put it basically in front of a picture of what they were going to be looking at, and they could sort of rotate it and things like that. But it wasn't a convincing, it wasn't like an immersive experience. It was useful for when they did the presentation, they kind of moved the object around while they were talking about it to create interest in it.
Right.
And I thought that was effective, but I thought about using Unity. I haven't gotten that sophisticated in terms of capturing the HDRI and being able to like put it in place. I'm getting more into Blender, which I think has some of that capability.
Yeah. So let me suggest a lower tech entry point that if you thought of Blender and billboarding, I suppose it depends upon the location, but if you thought of billboard, if it's an urban location and you thought of billboarding your storefronts so that it wasn't trying to be photogrammetry, super complex mesh. It wasn't trying to be like, it might not need to be HDRI, sophisticated lighting, but rather billboards with textures slapped onto them that create a compellingly believable representation of the space. And then more of the focus becomes on the object within, perhaps. That definitely Blender to Unity to VR, that's a pipeline that works well for that. I mean, the HDRI is, with a program called PT GUI, it's not challenging to shoot and build your own HDRI based on your capture. So if you shoot bracketed, low f-stop to high f-stop, the whole 9 yards to get your dynamic range, you can use that to build your own HDRI of a location. But I guess I wonder how critical is that to the people experiencing this? Or is it enough if they see, oh, there's that building and there are the trees and there's the paving below me and I feel like I'm in that space?
I think that's probably a pretty accurate comment. I think it was more me being like obsessing about it than, they didn't care. They seemed to like it the way it was. But
yeah.
I just think in the future, I'd like to be able to, I'm kind of like thinking about ways to do that.
Yeah.
Effectively.
I mean, and there's also some, if you wanted to combine photogrammetry, let's say you had a drone fly over a site, like you could project the texture. I mean, it's really talking kind of about what you did with a bull, where you could take the texture from a photogrammetry where the mesh wasn't really perfect, but you got a lot of great detail in the texture. Yeah. And then in Blender, you could make a very simple polygonal model and you could project between the two so that you get a simple low detail model that moves quickly in VR. Its texture got kind of burned in through this much more comprehensive photogrammetry process. And then you're going to combine the best of both worlds. But that would be only if you were actually calculating a lot of photogrammetry detail.
Yeah. Well, along with the drone thing, the new sensors on like the new iPhones and I think some of the other things can do, like you can walk around and get a decent texture of I would say like an extended area, not like a huge area. And I kind of tried that and it came out kind of compelling. But I wasn't sure what to do with the horizon or anything else in the area. Like I didn't build a box around it to, like I couldn't merge that with then an HDRI in a convincing way. But that was a nitpicking, I think.
Yeah. So are these spaces that are fairly wide, large scale landscape?
This was a cemetery, so it was wide. So
challenging.
Yeah. But yeah, just stuff that I'm thinking of and think in the future would be, because some of the people that I know will apply for projects that involve public spaces, so they're going to be kind of expansive typically, but it'd be cool. And then I think like where it was going with the AR and being able to put a marker down and do something convincingly in that space would also be pretty awesome too. But right now, everything's over Zoom and people are, you invite a bunch of people to a Zoom meeting, so nobody's on the site anyways, but so.
Yeah, that yeah, it is pretty exciting when you think about if you have a commission for a space, like you could make the call be send us the marker for your artwork, and the whole committee is going to go on site, and one at a time we're going to drop the markers down, and we're going to experience a version before we decide who to. I mean, I guess it's also hugely problematic because then you're saying, who are these people to judge based on some virtualized experience? But it's quite powerful. Or you have a rotating gallery of every month there's a new, scan the marker, there's something new here every week that happens. And so, walk through this part of town because this is now your rotating exhibit of contemporary sculptural virtual art.
And that's an idea at another site that somebody asked me about that I'd love to try to put together in the future too. So yeah, I love how like the lines between reality and digital environments are just totally blurred, and you can go the other way too. You can print out things that were never real, make them real, and then turn them into metal after that. And it's just really exciting where everything's going right now.
Absolutely. Well, Peter, you should definitely reach out to us because we I'm sure it sounds like you've got great resources, but we also have people working and grad students, and the interests are definitely overlapping here. And being Durham centric, or at least after COVID, being back there more regularly, that there might be a really nice opportunity to bridge these different groups together and maybe come up with some public art call or program. Could be really fun.
Yeah, I'd love that. I'm basically like an amateur at this stuff, so like finding other people who are also doing it is really pretty awesome. I didn't realize I guess I didn't look at your background before the talk, and I didn't realize you were into the photogrammetry stuff as well, so that's pretty awesome.
Yeah, and we have in the fall, we have a couple of instructional events this spring, and in the fall we're having more showcases. So I'd love to have you as part of that showcase. We have people from the Coastal Lab that use it to chart marine ecosystems. We have people who are using it for medical, like preoperative stuff. I mean, it's really exciting to bring into a room a wide variety of people using it and realize how it's become this interesting universal method of describing space and object.
I'll email you my contact information. So, and then, yeah, just let me know like what's going on. So
I'm putting my email in the chat so you can use
awesome.
that one. Great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Fun.
Yeah.
Kevin, I think